and thank you for tuning in and listening to this show today. And so we want to welcome all our listeners and thank you for tuning in. We have an exciting show for you today, and I want everybody to listen to this show today and help us out. So right now, why don't you go and text somebody or call 7 people and tell them to tune in to this show right now. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this morning we have a good one for you. This week's topic: the racial divide, America's perception of law enforcement and police brutality. And we have as our guest today Dr. Sid Martinez. Dr. Sid Martinez is an assistant professor at the University of San Diego. He joined the Department of Sociology in the fall of 2013. Let me give you a little of his scholarly work. Dr. Martinez's research focuses on criminology, urban politics, religion, immigration, social theory, and interracial relations, with an emphasis on Latinos and African Americans. He is currently conducting a comparative study of Northern and Southern California that examines the relationship between local police, clergy, and community institutions in addressing youth violence. The study aims to further theoretical understanding to how perceived legitimacy conditions law enforcement's ability to address youth violence. His book manuscript, Managed Violence, Community Institutions, and the Peace of the Inner City, is currently under contract with New York University Press. The book focuses on how Latinos and African Americans manage violence in South Los Angeles. And so his teaching interests are criminology, juvenile delinquents, deviance, social theory, and urban sociology. So, Dr. Martinez, thank you for being on the show, and welcome to What's Happening Now.
It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
Now, how it's been? Because you've been a regular on our show, and I know that you lost your son, and that was a tragedy, and most definitely been praying for you, and it's good to see that you're backing up and at it, because that is something that no parent should have to see, and I think that's the greatest nightmare that a parent would have, because we expect our children to bury us, and we don't expect, especially when you're unprepared for it and it just all of a sudden happens, to have to bury your child. And so it's very good to see you back up and at it, and ready to take the bull by the horn and say, go. So how you been doing?
I'm doing well, and I find that it has been a difficult time for me and my family, but being involved in these kinds of issues, that's what I have a passion for. It gives me a sense of purpose.
Right.
Social justice, working with the community, I find that to be very rewarding and kind of healing as well.
Now, why did you choose sociology? I mean, when you went for your education and career, what made you go into that field?
Well, I grew up in Fresno, and every time you ask someone, they ask you where you're from, you say Fresno, they always have this disgusted look on their face. But it turns out Fresno's got some issues. But there was a lot of poverty in Fresno, and a lot of my family lived in southeast Fresno, West Fresno. These were the Latino, African American parts of town. And at a very young age, I understood that there were issues about race, issues about poverty. And I always wanted to learn more about it. So as I got older and I thought about what do I want to study, I wanted to understand those dynamics. Why does it happen? What are the solutions? And that became my passion for studying sociology.
Wow, that's awesome. So have you been keeping up with the events that have taken place this week?
It's hard not to.
It's hard not to. So before, I just want to ask another question in that. I mean, what was your thoughts when you saw those videos of the 2 young men that got killed by the police, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile? What read through your mind first one day, and then you hear it again? It's like, what? What's going on here? Is this surely this is an old video that's now circulating, but kind of find out both of these incidents just happened.
Well, I was, like you said, still trying to make sense of the first event in Louisiana, and the way that force was used on this young man who was selling CDs. But I guess they thought he had a gun, and what I'd like to know more about was he armed? Was he going for a weapon? And just from what I've seen, it seems that the use of force is highly questionable.
Right.
There needs to be more detail. So as I'm trying to understand that, then you see the video with the young man who worked at a school. Mm-hmm. He worked in a cafeteria. Mm-hmm. Children loved him. No criminal record. And what was different about that case was, here's a man who had a permit to carry a weapon.
Yes.
And he complied with law enforcement. He did everything he was supposed to do, mm-hmm. and he was still shot. So that one, I mean, they're similar, but what was, I think, more shocking about the second one is, here's someone who was not being defiant. This guy was being completely cooperative. It appears everything he's supposed to do, and I think the fact that the governor of Minnesota came out, and I have to give him credit, mm-hmm. because he recognized that it was an issue of race, and there was very questionable use of force.
Right.
So the two cases are very similar, but yet they're very different in that you really have to say that in the Minnesota case, this young man did everything he was supposed to, and that's what made that even more shocking. Not to say that the first one wasn't.
Right.
We don't have all the context, but I think with the social media now we're starting to see what has been happening for a long time. So in some ways, America may say we have a problem. This has been going on for a long time, but now with social media, it's really advancing a question of police-community relations in race, and this is nothing new. Mm-hmm. You mentioned my book at the beginning of this program.
Uh-huh.
You can still drive through parts of South Central LA. You can still drive through parts of Watts, and you can see burned out buildings. So this is, you think about the biggest civil unrest in this country, mm-hmm. and it's exactly about police-community relations. And here we are again. It's the same story.
Man, and the amazing thing. When I look at this, and I'm sure you have some input on it too, is that I know when I was growing up, and I'm a former gang member, and I dealt with the police all the time. Always had them draw guns on me, because of the life that I was living and so on, the situations that I found myself in. But it seems to me, and I could be wrong about this because I didn't keep up with data back then. I was too involved in the streets. But it seems to me that law enforcement had more discipline back then. They would kick your butt and beat you and stuff like that. And I know folks were being shot and shouldn't have been shot, but it just seems like, and maybe it's like you said because of social media and all that, but it just in video cameras on your phone, but it just seemed like they were more disciplined back then versus now,
But there's a good book by a guy named Joe Dominic. He's not a social scientist, mm-hmm. but I don't agree with everything he says, but he makes an interesting point about the chief of police in Los Angeles in the 60s at the time, mm-hmm. Chief Parker, was there for a long time.
I heard about him.
Yeah. and he said, somebody asked him, how much has the police evolved? Mm-hmm. How much did it evolve in the 60s versus the 90s? Mm-hmm. And he said in the 60s, the police department, he was really trying to clean up corruption. Mm-hmm. So as long as you were clean, that's all that mattered. Mm-hmm. And if you had to go rough someone up, mm-hmm. He didn't have a problem with that. So actually in the 60s, I know I'm using LA as a lot of examples. The use of force for Parker wasn't really a big deal. It was more about cleaning up the department because it had a legacy of corruption.
Yeah.
So that the use of force in the 60s in Los Angeles really wasn't a big deal until mm-hmm. 65 when everything mm-hmm. blew up, and then it came to light. Hey, maybe this isn't the best way. So. I think police use of force, they're starting to become more disciplined, mm-hmm. more aware, but obviously they got a long ways to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you a question, can you give us an historical understanding of the relationship between police and the black and brown community?
Okay, so here we go. This is something I'm very passionate about. Sometimes students will refer to this as tedium. There's a lot of details here.
Take your time.
But if we're talking about the emergence of the police in the United States, it happens in 3 different places simultaneously.
Okay.
So in the South, there's this relationship between the police and hunting down fugitive slaves.
Okay.
So even before there was a police department, you don't get the first police force in the United States till about 1856 in New York City.
Oh, okay.
So there was no organized police
force.
So before they had marshals.
Got you.
or sheriffs. And what they would do, their job was not to go out and make sure that crime wasn't happening. They went after fugitives. So the judge would say, so-and-so is wanted for something, and then they'd go out and get them. So, you get the first police force in the United States in the Northeast. And in that system, it happens because cities are starting to evolve.
Right.
And it's becoming urbanized. And so America doesn't know what to do with all these people coming into cities.
Got you.
And this becomes kind of the impetus for the creation of the first police force in the United States. And so there's a big debate about what their goal was. But basically, the police in the Northeast, big cities in New York, Boston, what their goal was to try to balance two things: the interests of the business people, because they wanted to have some kind of order to make money and for the local business to function, and the police had to regulate what was known as the dangerous class. The dangerous class were people who came from these rural areas, and they were hanging out in the streets. They were workers, and they needed to find a way to regulate vagrants, prostitutes, and so they referred to...
Break down to us vagrant.
Yeah, so a vagrant is like a homeless person, right? Someone who doesn't really have a place to live, or maybe somebody who's just traveling around on trains, right? Kind of like I hate to use the word, but hobo, right? That what we would call something like that. So that became the primary goal in the very beginning of the United States. It was really about regulating the poor and maintaining the interest of business. And so some of the works I've seen say that was kind of their goal. It's not that they were completely favoring the business elite, and they weren't just cracking down on the working class and the poor. They had to kind of balance those two interests. That's the story of the police in the Northeast. So from the very beginning, the police in the United States was established to somehow deal with the poor, the marginal. What do we do with these people in the city? In the South, it's very different. In the South, you can trace the origins of police going back to slavery. And their goal was to sort of regulate fugitive slaves that had committed crimes. And when they actually started to develop their own police forces in the late 19th century, that legacy of dealing with people of color was kind of, how should we say, there was a precedent that had already been set, and it became part of the police in the South. That whole idea, that racial caste system, it was hard for it not to become part of policing in the South. And then in the West, there was really, you have to remember that you had this history between the United States and Mexico, and when it got colonized, when Mexico no longer had control of California, you had a system of law in place, and it kind of looked like the system in the South. And so you had a system in place, but it didn't really apply to Latinos. So real quick story, I don't know if people have heard about the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, but he was a Californian. He was from Mexico. He lived in California, and he got robbed. They stole his money. I did something to his family, and so he went to the local sheriff and he said, "Look what they did. Can you help me out?" And they looked at him, and they said, the sheriffs, and they said, "We forgot to tell you, the law doesn't apply to Mexicans here." So, in California. So what he does, he becomes an outlaw. He was an honest guy, becomes an outlaw, and then he hunts down people who had assaulted his family, that had robbed him, and then he turns into a fugitive or outlaw. So that's just kind of the story, but that's kind of the very beginning of the law. So you had three different kinds of police forces. In the South, you have the slavery. In the North, you have urbanization, and in the West, it's not until 1910 you get a police force professionalized like in the Northeast.
Wow, that's amazing. And we're gonna take a break, and then we're gonna come back, because I do have a question in regards to that, because when you look at the sheriffs and look at the police and the marshals, like to see how versus what they do today. How did they function together back then, or what was the differences? Did they all do the same thing? But we're going to take a break and for commercials, and we'll be right back in a couple of minutes. So stay tuned to what's happening now on KBLK Radio, and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to what's happening now on KBLKRadio.com, and this is your host with Dr. Sid Martinez. And we're talking about law enforcement, giving a little history on it. and we're talking about the 19th century going back to the 1800s and how law enforcement got set up and so on. And so wanted to just pick back up on that and, move into the 20th century also. When we look at law enforcement back then, and when you say the police first established in New York and then moved to the South and then to the West and so on, right. What would you say the difference was between the marshals, the sheriffs, and the police?
Yeah, so the marshals, again, they weren't out there policing, looking for crime. They were going after people that were wanted. That was their job.
Okay.
And the American police force models itself after London. England had the first formal police force. An interesting little story how they formed their police force. They had invaded and occupied Ireland for a long time, and they couldn't control the Irish. The Irish were very stubborn people, very rebellious.
Right.
And so this guy who was in charge of creating the police force, he made a brilliant move. Mm-hmm. And what he said is, we're not here to occupy you or to occupy this area as a military force. This is the first move he made in developing the police force. He said, we're here to maintain peace. Notice the difference in language, right? One is about occupation.
Exactly.
The other one is about peace.
Peace.
So this model gets borrowed by the United States, and then just to kind of pick up,
peace officers.
Peace officers, right? They're not soldiers. They're there to maintain peace. So then we get to California, I think, which is kind of where I left off in the West. And in the West, you don't really have an established police force. They don't become very professional until about 1910, but they were very corrupt. But then crime goes down. You get a very kind of formal police force that kind of looks like the Northeast in the West around 1910.
Right.
Now, one thing I do want to emphasize, because a lot of people want to know, why aren't the police accountable? How did this happen? And as a sociologist, what we look at institutions, and we want to know how institutions evolve. So, interestingly, in the 20th century and in part of the late 19th century, most police forces, especially in the Northeast and in the Midwest, were controlled by political machines.
Okay.
Right, and for people that don't know what machines are, machines were these bosses who operated outside of City Hall. And they were able to win favor by paying people off.
Wow.
Right? I get you a job if you vote for me. It was a whole system of favoritism that affected city politics. So people didn't like that. They wanted to root out corruption. And so over time in America, they wanted to depoliticize the police. Take the politics out.
Right.
And here's the thing that most people don't realize. In the process of doing that, they made the police so autonomous from politics that they were able to insulate what they did outside of public view.
Wow.
So I'll give you an example. What are some specific things? So the ability to hire police officers, fire police officers, and most importantly, to reprimand police officers became increasingly an in-house thing.
And when you say in-house, who was in the house?
The chief of police, captains, right? So they started.
Were they elected?
These chiefs of police were a lot of times appointed, but once they were appointed, they had the authority to reprimand their own officers. Kind of like today, right? So the development of police forces emerges in a really interesting way, and it was an attempt to take the politics out. But the negative thing of that is now they have so much autonomy. Now we fight. What do we fight for now? We fight for police review boards. We fight for independent police auditors. We fight for all sorts of ways to include the public in being involved in policing.
Right.
And that's one of the things that most people don't think about is how the police as an entity evolved to be autonomous within city government.
Man. And so. In the 20th century, when did it start moving towards that? In the 20th century or back in the 19th century?
Probably around the beginning of the 20th century. It was a whole attempt to get rid of machine politics and to remove the police from machine politics control.
Got you.
To completely take the politics out. Now the problem with that is everything is political in City Hall, right?
Yeah.
So even though we say that it's not political, there's still kind of a very strong there's a lot of politics involved in policing. But I think that's the real challenge when we talk about what happened in Louisiana, or we talk about what happened in Minnesota, is how do we, as you had mentioned earlier in our conversation,
right.
how do we hold the police accountable,
Absolutely.
given these kind of institutional barriers that are in place? And the other thing that most people should know about the police in the United States is the United States has a unique police force in a very special way, and that is our police force is the only police force in the world that is controlled by city government. So each city government, Los Angeles, San Diego, has control over its police department.
Who should have that control?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. Some people would say, well, maybe it's a good thing that we have local control over police, right? Because after all, local police know the issues.
Right.
In theory, they know people, right? They know communities that they.
If you compare it to policing, right?
Now the problem is, one of the negative things about having local controlled police is that when there is abuse,
right,
who is going to investigate instances of police brutality?
Right.
And so one of the problems is how do we get local government, how do we get the police to police themselves? Right. And I think that's where the problem is. And I think recently in California, Governor Brown has been talking about anytime there is a officer-involved shooting, it should automatically go to some independent state board or commission to review the evidence, right?
Right.
And investigate what happened. Because I think it's very difficult to do a thorough investigation of a police involved shooting when the police are the ones, not to say that they can't be fair, but that's a situation where you need an objective outside agency to review the information and the details regarding the shooting.
Right.
And I think that's what needs to happen. We need to have, I think it's important for police to be locally controlled, but when it comes to instances of abuse or police involved shootings, that should be maybe a situation where we need to have state government more involved in overseeing the shootings or in terms of investigation. And I know in Minnesota, for example, the Department of Justice got involved to review the shooting.
Do you think that was the right move?
I think that was the right move, but I think what's problematic about that is, in some instances, the Department of Justice gets involved. If that woman hadn't had that video, right, of her boyfriend getting shot,
absolutely.
If that video of the young man in Louisiana, if that video wasn't there, these issues would not be going to the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
These would probably be dealt with locally. So the Department of Justice is important, but they get involved in a kind of ad hoc way. Sometimes they're involved, sometimes.
Look at civil rights and stuff like that. That was violated.
Right.
Versus, just prosecuting this officer for shooting somebody. Or whatever.
So what I'm saying is you need to have a process in place. Every time there's a shooting, it goes to this committee or this process that reviews, and it goes away from or it gets escalated to a state or federal level for review.
Now, one of the things that I was thinking here, and I know Al, also our technician in here, is in regards to officers that kill someone, they are placed on paid leave. And I was just thinking about this the other day because, for me, it seems as though, I don't know if there should be levels of deciding what to do as far as levels of discipline. And it's not so much discipline, but as far as because like if I got in a fight on my job, I'm going to get suspended and without pay. And then eventually get fired, or if I can prove that, hey, I did wrong, then when they bring me back, they may pay me back. They'll pay me. But, and then of course, union contracts, they can put you off so long, and then they have to start paying you and all these other kind of things if they haven't come up with a discipline yet. But it seems as though these guys, there's nothing to discipline them, let alone the convictions that we don't get. But even when they do this, it seems as though they do it and then they get paid. They're on administrative leave with pay. They don't even mention that because they still getting paid. I mean, there's nothing done there. They off the streets, but they still getting paid.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a difficult situation because police, they're unionized, right? So that's something that standard procedure. I guess they get put. I think after there's any shooting, they get paid on an administrative leave, but it's hard to make a determination whether they should be punished without some sort of review process, right?
Right.
So if it was an officer and they found that clearly that it was an egregious use of police force, then of course that's when you'd want to have their salary revoked or removed. But until then, I think it would be very difficult to take their pay away if we don't know all the facts, right? That's probably what the police would say, and that's probably what the unions would say.
Oh yeah. And about the unions, because I'm a union man,
right?
But I have a problem with the police unions from the perspective that they never, ever, at least maybe it has happened, but I have not seen it or experienced in my world, where they come forward and denounce violence, denounce some of the killings that the police officers are doing. They always seem to justify it in some kind of way, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. You know, everybody kind of sees it from their perspective, but you know, I think whenever there's an instance, that's where the leadership needs to step up, right? When the governor of Minnesota stepped up and said, would this have happened to a white man? No, it wouldn't have, right? That race clearly was a factor. So there comes a time when the police need to just own what they do.
That's what I'm saying.
And as soon as once they own it, then they can start to have a conversation about what happened. But I think there's the way this thing gets framed right now in America is that you can't be pro Black Lives Matter and pro law enforcement, as if the two are separate, right? And I think it's, at least from my perspective, you can tell me whether you agree or disagree with this, that, you know, Black Lives Matters is about nonviolence. Right? People, I mean, so I know this Mika Johnson, the guy who shot the police officers. A lot of people are saying, well, Obama's responsible for this,
of course,
right? Yeah. Black Lives Matters is responsible for this. I think I even saw a tweet from somebody in one of the police officers from St. Louis that said this was blood on Obama's hands. When the fact of the matter is, both law enforcement and Black Lives Matters do not want violence.
Right. And here's and here's the thing. You know, I was listening to Trevor Noah on
right. He made a comment about this.
He was talking about, you know, the pro-life. I mean, not pro-life, pro-black versus pro-police, and you can be both, you know. But somehow in America, you're for one thing and you're against the other. You know?
Right.
And which is wrong in that sense. And I think that when we talk about blame, you know, on one end of the stick, when a police officer shoots somebody, we have it on video, and kill somebody, you know, the police unions and all these other folks come forward and say, oh, well, you know, there's stuff you don't see in the camera. You don't know what he's going through, what he's thinking, what he's feeling, and all these, so we got to wait for all the facts to come out. But then when someone like Mika Johnson does that, they immediately want to blame Black Lives Matter. They immediately want to blame the president. You didn't even wait till all the facts come out. You haven't even waited for them to do an investigation. So there seems to be unfair assessments of these shootings, you know, and America is divided when it comes to race and when it comes to law enforcement and police brutality, because you have on one end those who will say, you know, defend the police, and then there's those on the other end that is getting the brunt end of the violence and the brutality. You're saying, well, hey, wait a minute, this is not fair. We need to stop. We need to do something about this, and you know, we can't even have a honest discussion about it because of all the hostility that comes along with, you know, either end, you know, fighting, arguing, and calling names and blaming each other and so on. And so to me, what can we do to get folks to sit down and have an honest conversation?
You know, that there is a divide. There's a real divide, right? I mean, I think, you know, and I've worked with law enforcement with some of my work, and I have a lot of respect for what they do.
Right.
I know you've done a lot of work. I mean, you're on the front lines. Whenever there's a shooting in San Diego, you're there.
Right. Right.
You're there, and you have to work with the police. That's just the reality of it. But I think there is a misconception in this country that people, that African Americans, that Latinos, that Black Lives Matters movements are basically out to get the police, and that is not the case.
Not true. Yeah.
You know, are there people out there that believe that, like Mika Johnson? Mm-hmm. They are, but those are peripheral people on the margins who had, by the way, no connection to Black Lives Matter. Even when they asked him, he said he wasn't affiliated with any group. Right. So for the most part, I think Black Lives Matters is really trying to have a discussion with the police to engage them. And I think certain people on the law enforcement side understand that as well. But I think it's really going to take the leadership on the law enforcement side to sit down with people in black and brown communities to start that. It has to start with the leadership. And we have to hear their voices to begin a dialogue. I think that's the key.
Absolutely. Why do you think so many black men are being killed by the police right now? I mean, what's going on with that?
Well, you know, I was looking at some statistics. There's a website. It's called The Counted. Mm-hmm. And the Counted is a great site because it keeps track of all the shootings in the United States, every one of them.
Okay.
And in many instances, they'll profile the individuals. Mm-hmm. And the statistics that I saw last year, there were 1,134 shootings.
Wow.
Police-involved shootings. This year, and you know, granted, we still have August, September, October, November. We still have 5 months to go. Mm-hmm. We're at 564 officer-involved shootings this year. So we're on. It seems to be a little bit lower, but we're not too far off from last year. And the statistics show, we don't have very good statistics, but we know that African American males, young black men, are twice as likely to be shot than white males. Okay, so it's a fact. A lot of people say they'll look at numbers and they'll say, well, there's actually more white people shot than blacks. Yeah, but yeah, you hear that all the time. But as a percentage of the population, African Americans are twice as likely to be shot. I think Latinos are 1.5 times more likely to be shot, and then it's whites, and then Asians.
Yeah.
So the facts are there. We don't have very good facts, but it's obvious that African American males are being shot at a rate that we don't see for whites. So that's the question. So that's the facts. Those are the facts.
That's for sure.
Okay. So then the question is, well, why is that the case?
Yeah.
And I think that there's lots of different reasons for this, but I think a lot of law enforcement individuals, and I think San Diego PD is trying to address this with some of the work that we're doing, right? Mm-hmm. They don't know the communities that they patrol. They don't know the individuals. They don't have relationships with them. I'm not talking about San Diego PD. I'm talking about other police departments in general.
Right.
And so when you don't know a community, you don't know the individuals, it's very difficult to humanize them, especially when they're not white.
Right.
And so there's some research that shows that you got 3 different things going on that happens, I think, to police. One is that some research I've seen from Rob Sampson, he's a sociologist at Harvard, that police officers already have preconceived notions about the communities they patrol, and they bring them in. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. And it turns out that applies to whites, but oddly enough, that also applies to Latino and black officers as well. They have these conceptions about communities, and they bring them into the communities that they police. Right. Some of Sampson's other work shows that if you look at an area and you see graffiti and you see maybe it looks a little rundown, that also causes fear amongst police officers. They view that as a kind of disorder or a potential for crime.
Now I saw, and if I can just interject, I saw a debate on TV with an officer from New York, and I don't know why they always bring these officers in from New York to come on these shows, but he was saying that because one of the things he's talking about is law enforcement being afraid of black people. And he said, all the years he worked in law enforcement, he didn't know one officer that is scared of a black person. And so I know that's the argument out there. We're not afraid of black, but the thing I thought is that, but you do see them as violent and dangerous.
Right.
And so therefore you are more alert and more like ready to defend yourself, thinking that some kind of harm may come to you because you come around a person of color,
well,
especially black and brown.
And that was the next point I was going to make. So it's preconceived ideas. Some of the research shows it's the way a neighborhood looks, and it's the number of African Americans or Latinos who are together, concentrated. And those three things evoke feelings of disorder and the potential for crime. Now, I will say one other thing that I think that a lot of people haven't talked about. We also live in a period where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of inequality right now. And a lot of things that are mental health issues, that are issues related to families. A lot of the social programs that were in place don't exist no more. So when things blow up, and I kind of empathize with the police on this point, who's going to go out there to deal with that situation, right? And so when you put an armed person out in the community to deal with a social issue, right? It's a family issue. Johnny's running away from school. He's acting out with his parents. Uncle John's on meth, right? Someone else has got mental health issues. And now the police are coming in to deal with what are social issues, social problems. That's a bad formula, right? So you put someone who's not trained to deal with mental health issues. Who do you call? Call the police, right?
They fix all my problems.
Right. And then if that person acts out, looks a little aggressive, maybe they got a knife on them. Now you've got an officer involved shooting. So I think one of the things, in all fairness to police, is they're being asked to deal with all the social ills related to inequality. And when we put police officers in that position, they're not trained to do that. I interviewed a lot of police officers in some of my other work, and they would tell me, these were the ones that were less community oriented in some of my research, they would say, we're not here to make friends with people. We're here to take people to jail. And that defines the relationship between the police and the community. If you're not there to get to know people, if your job is to take people to jail, you've already kind of set in play a certain type of adversarial relationship.
So when we see you, we know why you're there. You're there to take people to jail. And the rest of it, I remember I heard a deputy sheriff say that one time, that I was at there was coffee with the sheriffs or whatever, and one of the sergeants got up and said, I love taking people to jail. I love locking people up. And I'm like, huh? And so when you look at community-oriented policing, when did we move in that direction? Because when I came up, I know, but see, with me, I went through different phases. As a little kid, I came up during the Black Panther era, and I saw a lot of violence, a lot of killings, and we would go down the street and see blood, and washing blood down the street and things like that. And I knew the police was in the midst of that because they were trying to uphold the law or whatever. And so at a young age, I kind of was afraid of the police, And I remember one day me and my mom was walking across the street in the police park as we walked across the street. I said, come on, let's hurry up and get across the street, before the police get us. And my mom explained to me that, if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have to worry about blah, 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 all these good old things. So I after that, calmed down this song from a different light, that as long as I'm not doing anything wrong. But then as I grew up, I started doing things wrong. I started breaking the law and all of that. So during that period of time and phase of time, I had that outlook that, I'm into some bad stuff. And anytime I see the police, I want to go the other way because I know I'm wrong. I know I'm doing things wrong. But at the same time, there were police officers that I did meet that seemed to be decent officers and seemed to some sense, even white officers seemed to care, with the conversations they would have with you and things like that. And I don't know if they were told to do community-oriented policing or whatever, and that was back in the 70s and going to the 80s. So, when did law enforcement really start moving, if their job was just to enforce the law, lock people up, when did they start moving towards community-oriented policing, where they want to help solve problems and bring down arrest rates and those type of things?
That's a good question. So we start seeing community policing in the 60s. After the uprisings, the upheavals, the civil unrest in the 60s, police departments start focusing more on community policing, getting to know residents, getting them more involved. And so community policing, I think, offers a lot of promise for dealing with a lot of problems that we're talking about, because the relationship isn't just defined by taking people to jail, right? It's getting to know people, and it's getting people from the community involved in the policing process. It's actually smarter policing. And I think, you look at Chicago, they had a great program, it was called the CAPS program in the 80s. And I think what makes good community policing is not just showing up at meetings and talking to people. Some people call that community policing. That's, in my view...
Chief Zimmerman needs to understand that.
Okay.
Up at meetings. Don't take it out on me.
But I think a real community policing is democratic. It's democratic where the police and the community sit at the table and they come up with a plan together, and the community has equal voice in what policing is going to look like. So equality and power is the key to effective community policing, but we don't see a lot of that. What we see, my big critique of community policing, even though I think it has a lot of potential, is it's top down. It's still coming from downtown, telling people, we're going to do community policing, but this is how I'm telling you you're going to do it. That's not the most effective form of community policing. And let me just say one other thing related to community policing, because I think this kind of undoes community policing. We also have a kind of policing in the United States, and it's a kind of policing where they go out and they look for disorder, and it's called broken windows policing.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Okay, so broken windows policing, which by the way is kind of connected to a lot of the incidents, police-involved shootings, they kind of precipitated. So broken windows policing is if you have graffiti or you have broken windows, that these little small things create an environment and incentives and rewards for people to commit more crime.
I got you.
So what the police say is, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be proactive, and I'm going to go after people who are committing some of these small crimes. And some of it may be as small as having a broken taillight.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
And so those kinds of things, there's starting to be more studies done on broken windows policing, and it turns out it's not the most effective form of policing. If anything, it really agitates residents, and they feel like they're being harassed, right? So you've got two different models that I think are contradictory in the United States right now. We have broken windows policing, which is aggressive form of policing, going after sort of small things that police think are going to lead to bigger things. And then you have the rhetoric of community policing, and in some ways, So on the one hand, you have a police officer pulling you over for a broken taillight, then asking you all sorts of other questions, the pretext stops, right? Then the next day, you have police officers coming in, and they want to be community policing officers. So what are people in that neighborhood going to say?
That's what we see too,
right? And so I really think that there needs to when we talk about community policing, we also need to talk about how this kind of broken windows types of policing in some ways can negate the positive things that community policing does. And sometimes it's the same officers. I've seen this. I'm not going to mention it. I'm not talking about San Diego. But in other police departments I've seen where you'll have an officer go out and he just kicks someone's door in because there was a raid, and then the next day he comes back with a pastor and they say, "What can we do to help you?" Right? And so people in that neighborhood are looking at that officer and they're saying, "This is the same guy who roughed us up, and now he wants to build relations."
Wow.
So I've seen very little discussion about how one type of policing actually can undermine how broken windows, and I'm just using that term, there's different versions of it, can undermine community policing efforts. There needs to be a discussion about how these programs are kind of contradictory, I think, if we're talking about policing.
Yeah, and it seems like, like you said, when you look at law enforcement, they're doing both. You have some of the same officers doing both. And I know, actually to hire more officers in to do more community-oriented policing, but it seems as though the culture and the mindset has to be changed too, because even if they do more community-oriented policing, if they still doing what you call the broken window policing, then it's still going to be a problem. Because don't stop me unless there's a real need to stop me. No pretext stop. Don't just automatically think I'm a crook and I'm a criminal because I'm black and I look gangster or whatever, and so on. Now, I mean, if you build relationships and you know people and so on, then you would know who the real crooks are. You would know. You wouldn't stop me, and I'm a hard-working man, and I've got a family, and I'm not engaged or involved in gangs or drugs or any type of crime. I'm a law-abiding citizen. You would know that if that's Cornelius. You would know that. But if you're not engaged in the community, you would know that. Now we understand that law enforcement has to keep law and order. They have to get out there and arrest people and things like that when that needs to be. But I think good policing, when you look at community-oriented policing and you look at good policing, we'll see if they're really doing well in community-oriented policing, we'll see the arrests go down, and we'll see more problems being solved in the community, and we'll see a community of law enforcement community working together versus, what the problems and issues that we have now. And even when there are problems or something happened with law enforcement and the community, they can come together and, solve that problem.
Yeah, and you're right. It is more. It's effective policing because when you have community members involved, they know who's committing the crime, right? And if they don't know, they know other individuals who can help the police to deal with certain issues. So I think that community policing and policing in general needs to move away from the mindset that we're just here to take people. We're not here to get to know people. We're here to take people to jail. There has to be a concerted effort to integrate and get connected with the community.
Yeah.
And that starts with meeting with people on a regular basis, getting their input. But I think you said something else that was that a lot of police departments are aware of. And I know they're starting to do this in San Diego because I know Lynn Sharp and some of her work is about trying to, and Tasha Williams is involved in this, trying to get police officers, new recruits, familiar with the community. What are the resources available? Who are some of the community leaders? So when they go in the communities, it's not a foreign place, and it's not a place where they don't know people and they don't feel comfortable, right? So I think, and that's what they call. I guess the word for that is implicit bias. How do you
talk to them about that? Police officer. They want another police officer to talk to them about that versus somebody from the outside coming in telling them that they have biases. That's amazing. But it tells you about the culture and what we're dealing with. I know we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
And I did want to ask you a question that kind of been bothering me, dealing with Mika Johnson and Dylan Roof. Of course, the federal government, Obama, and the attorney, what they call it, the attorney general or whatever, did not rule Dylan Roof as a terrorist. But even now, Obama's being careful with Mika Johnson not to use the term terrorist. But I am hearing it more frequently used now with Mika Johnson in the media, saying, "Oh, domestic terrorism." Now, what is the difference that you see between Mika Johnson and Dylan Roof outside of, I know law enforcement was killed here, but and blacks were killed here, both mass shootings.
Right.
But it seems like there's a difference in treatment here.
Yeah, well, anytime you can categorize someone as a terrorist, right, then you're able to treat them in a different way and view them in a way that makes them more dangerous, right? More criminal. And we don't have all the facts or details about Mika Johnson, but I know going back to the Dylan Roof incident, that seemed to be motivated by a lot of hate, right? And there's a history and a culture of that. The fact that he targeted a black church, and I don't recall whether he was part of some other organized organization, But I think to be a terrorist, you have to be sort of connected to some larger goal, right? You're acting on behalf, you're furthering the goal of some group. And I certainly don't think that was the case for Mika. He said he wasn't affiliated with anyone.
Organized.
But with Dylan Roof, I mean, you could say that there's a history of that in the South, right? And going back to the South, there was a long history, and he used some of that rhetoric as well. So I think we got to be very careful using the word terrorist.
Yes.
I don't think that it applies. I think it's just rhetoric being used to kind of vilify this guy even more. Don't get me wrong. What he did was heinous and evil. But I definitely think that Dylan Roof was part of a movement in the South based on a racial hierarchy, right? A whole history we can trace back to the Deep South and slavery.
Wow. So we got a couple of minutes left, and I did want to ask you another question in regards to transparency with the law enforcement.
Right.
And how can law enforcement build a culture of transparency and accountability in order to build public trust and legitimacy?
Okay, well, the first thing, I've been thinking a lot about this, and there was some discussion about this in some previous police-involved shootings, but you got to take the power away from grand juries. A lot of times when there's a shooting, it goes to the grand jury, and we know that in the grand jury, the DA is more likely to give a favorable ruling, right, for the police department.
Right.
So I think we need to put into place, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, at the state level, any police-involved shooting immediately goes to an outside independent agency, and I don't think that city government is sufficient.
Okay.
And I don't, even because some people would say independent police officers, they call them IPAs, right? Okay. Independent police officers are supposed to review any kind of police misconduct, and what's unique about them is they're not part of internal affairs.
Right.
My problem with independent police officers, those kinds of units, even though I think they're on the right track, is that they're still controlled by, most of the time, city managers.
Gotcha.
So you've got the mayor, the city manager, who's also kind of tight with the chief of police.
Yeah.
So I think even at that level, it's very hard to get a serious, rigorous investigation. So that's the first thing. We can't rely on grand juries. We need to get these kinds of investigations at the state and federal level, and we need to get practices in place so that it's not just once in a while, like in Minnesota.
Right.
Well, the DOJ gets involved in this one, but we didn't get involved in this one because no one had any video on it, right?
Yeah.
That would be the first thing. And the second thing is, I think that citizens should be involved in the process when there's officer-involved shootings.
Okay.
When there's some kind of reprimand, citizens should be involved in that process as well, because that was one of the things that was taken out of the public, as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, is that police departments have the sole power to reprimand officers. And I think there should be more public involvement regarding the facts and even whether officers should be reprimanded. They should at least have access and be involved. And we need to start, in order to have transparency, we need to have each police department start to collect data on officer-involved shootings. It needs to be a national thing. And outside of the website that I mentioned, the Counted, and I think the other one run by the Washington Post, we don't have a lot of data. We need to start collecting systematic data to see what's going on.
All right, we thank you for that, and Dr. Martinez, as always, it's been a pleasure, and we didn't get to finish, so we've got to have you back. So give me a date, you can come back, so we can get you back and have some more discussion on this. Thank you for tuning in to What's Happening Now on KBLKradio.com, and please tune back in next Sunday, 9 a.m. on KBLKradio.com.